Well, it's here after multiple days of saying it's almost here. Really, going back to last week, I think we were talking about how it's almost here. It's finally here. The start of training camp. Pitt will be in the South Side. Who knows? By the time you're watching this, they might be already practicing. They might already be done. We might be at media day. Might be doing interviews. Who knows when you watch this during the day on Wednesday? When I'm recording it, when I release it, it's before practice starts, which is around 9 or 9:30, something like that. And then they'll practice in the morning today. First practice of training camp. Yesterday was report day. Today is the first practice of training camp. They'll hold their practice. At 1 o'clock, Pat Narduzzi will address the media. After that, we'll talk to a bunch of players and assistant coaches. It's media day. It's the start of training camp. It's a lot of fun. And it's the 2025 football season. I mean, we still have another month until the season opener, but put another way, we have only a month until the season opener. It's been a long time coming, but we are finally here. So, on Monday, we talked about some facts and figures, everything you needed to know about the Pitt football team in 2025. Yesterday, we talked about the biggest storylines. Today, 22 short thoughts about Pitt football in 2025. Basically, just going to go position by position. Give you a little blurb on each spot. And it's not going to work out to exactly 22. It should if we went position by position, but we're probably going to talk about defensive end as a whole, and offensive line as a whole as opposed to each individual. Well, we'll probably mention each spot. But it was the Simpsons bit, 22 short films about Springfield. Today's 22 short thoughts about Pitt football in 2025. Let's not delay anymore. We'll jump into it here on the Wednesday edition of the Morning Pitt. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Wednesday. It's the first day of training camp edition of the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, the Pitt site on the 24/7 Sports Network, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Pitt football, Pitt basketball, Pitt recruiting, Pitt transfers, Pitt everything, all right here, or all right there at Panther-Lair.com. And, of course, for the next month, for the next 5 months, it's going to be a lot of football because that's what's happening, but it won't be everything. We'll have coverage of all kinds of Pitt sports at Panther-Lair.com, and, of course, lots of video content right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We have these daily morning Pitt videos. We talk about everything going on in the world of Pitt sports. We have our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night at 8:30. We'll be live tonight. Jim Hammett and I will be with you talking about everything we saw and learned and observed and heard at the first day of training camp. And we'll get your comments and questions as we move into the training camp mode of our live show. But we'll have post-game shows, press conferences, interviews, everything you need video-wise right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like this video and subscribe. That way you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. All right, 22 quick thoughts about Pitt football in 2025. Let's see how quick we can move on it. And we'll start, of course, with the quarterback. Not a lot to guess about there. You've got Eli Holstein coming back, 10 starts last season, 7-3 as a starter, even though he only played one drive plus a couple of plays in one of those games and, got hurt and missed in, time in another game. He only had one sort of full game loss, and that was the SMU game. Who knows how the Virginia game and the Louisville games would have gone if he had stayed healthy and played in them. Probably wouldn't have beat Louisville. Probably would have beat Virginia. Nevertheless, Eli Holstein's record as a starter is 7-3. He returns after suffering multiple injuries last season that cost him time in the final 6 games and no doubt contributed to the 6-game losing streak. He was probably still a little banged up in spring camp. Didn't have a great spring. We heard a lot of good things about Mason Heinchel, the true freshman. Didn't hear as many about Eli Holstein, but the expectation is still for Holstein to be the number one quarterback going into the season. That's how he enters training camp, and we imagine that that's how he will enter the 2025 season. Behind you, we've got Cole Gonzalez, the transfer from Western Carolina by way of Oklahoma, who's got a lot of history and background and experience in Cade Bell's offense. And then you've got Mason Heinchel, who I already mentioned, a true freshman that earned some rave reviews in spring camp. The quarterback position is very interesting. It's obviously very important, but I think you got some really unique and interesting storylines there between Eli Holstein and his return from last season and how he builds on that in year 2, and then the additions of Cole Gonzalez and Mason Heinchel. You lose Nate Yarnell and Julian Duggar, 2 promising players. One guy with some decent experience, one guy who showed a lot of promise and potential. But the guys you've got, I think, are pretty intriguing, and there's a chance for the quarterback position to be fairly strong. But that's probably going to depend on how Eli Holstein plays. At running back, you've got a returning All-American, at least on an all-purpose level, in Desmond Reed, a guy who I think has a chance, if he stays healthy, even relatively healthy, he's got a chance to go for 2,000 all-purpose yards, which there's only been two other guys in Pitt history who have done that. Quadri Henderson in 2016 when he had a lot of special teams yardage, and Tony Dorsett back in 1976. He might have done it twice, actually. But there are only two other players in Pitt history who put up 2,000-yard all-purpose yard seasons. And I think Desmond Reed has a chance to join that group if he stays even relatively healthy. Running backs are never going to have a perfectly healthy season. They play every snap of all 13 games. And so you sort of adjust your expectations in that regard and say, if he could get 11-plus games, so like 11 full games, then you're going to, then he's got a real chance, I think, to put up big numbers and potentially go for 2,000 all-purpose yards. I'm guessing the coaches won't take him off some of the special teams units, and that certainly helped his numbers a little bit last year when he had, I think, 1,700 all-purpose yards. But really where Desmond Reed makes the biggest impact is on offense, taking handoffs and catching passes. And I think he's equally dangerous at both of those. And teams, it's not going to be a surprise in 2025. Teams will know Desmond Reed is out there. They know he's coming. But I still don't know if they're going to be able to stop him, consistently stop him enough that he's not going to go off and have the kind of impact that he had last season. I think Desmond Reed, again, as long as he stays healthy, and I'm not one of these guys who thinks Desmond Reed is injury prone. I'm not one of these guys who thinks he's too small to stay healthy or something like that. I think he plays a position that takes a lot of contact and often has guys missing time because they get banged up. I think with almost every running back, there's a caveat of if he stays healthy. And Desmond Reed is no exception. If he does stay healthy and plays 11 full games plus, then I think he's got a legit shot at 2,000 all-purpose yards, and he's got a legit shot at being, maybe one of the best running backs in the ACC, one of the best running backs in the country. The problem with running back is the depth behind him, where Derek Davis didn't practice all spring and probably is going to be delayed on his start to training camp. And then you've got Joel Goff, who's a redshirt freshman who played in just a handful of games last year. And then you have three true freshmen. So you don't have much in the way of experience depth. Even Derek Davis, the older player that we talk about in this group, doesn't have all that much experience on the field. But he's at least played more than Joel Goff and the true freshmen have. Either way, depending on when Davis returns, Goff is going to be your backup, and one of the true freshmen or more are going to be behind him and probably see playing time. So you've got a star player at running back in Desmond Reed. And then you've got a lot of uncertainty and question marks behind him. At wide receiver, still looking for that top guy to emerge. They lose Konate Mumfield, the leading receiver from a year ago. They do return Raphael Williams, who led the team in receiving touchdowns last season with 6. But more importantly, they return Kenny Johnson, junior wide receiver, who should be poised to break out this year. This should be his year. This needs to be his year. Pitt needs him to have a big season because I'm not sure I see that another candidate on the team to sort of emerge as the wide receiver one. I think they're good players, solid players, explosive players. Raphael Williams, Sincere Lee, Blue Hicks, who transferred in from Louisville, the freshman who enrolled early, Tyreek Robinson, Zion Fowler. Like, they're solid receivers, explosive receivers. But where's that big-time number one receiver? It's supposed to be Kenny Johnson. Pitt needs it to be Kenny Johnson. Will it be Kenny Johnson? We don't know. We also don't know what the tight ends will provide this year. Decent production, really, overall. Like, numbers-wise, last year, you had one of the more productive seasons from the tight end position of the Pat Narduzzi era. Not as much in terms of touchdowns, but reception-wise, I think it led all the years of the Narduzzi era in the most receptions by the tight end group. Not as much in the way of yardage. And like I say, I think they were third or fourth among the tight end seasons at Pitt under Pat Narduzzi in terms of receiving touchdowns. But they lost Gavin Bartholomew, and I don't really think they replaced him with anybody. Period. That's the end of the sentence. They didn't really replace him with anybody. They brought in a transfer, and Justin Holmes, a guy who came from Marshall, and before that he was at Kent State. Not really much of a receiving threat, more of a blocker. Jake Overman will emerge as the tight end one this year after transferring from Oregon State last year. He played last season behind Gavin Bartholomew, and I thought he was fine. Useful receiver, more useful than I expected him to be, but I don't know if I see a game-breaking threat there. And the truth is, like, Cade Bell just hasn't used tight ends much in his career. When you look back at the Western Carolina seasons, they really didn't utilize the tight ends all that much. Again, last year the tight ends put up a lot of catches, but it still didn't really translate much into impact. Will the tight end position be impactful this year? I'm not really sure that it will. And so I've sort of set my expectations really low for the tight ends this season. Maybe they'll exceed them. On the offensive line, you've got, arguably the most important position. Yesterday when we were talking about the biggest storyline, somebody commented on the YouTube video, said offensive line. And you're right. A lot of it's going to come down to the offensive line. When we talk about the reasons why Pitt lost 6 games in a row last season to finish the year, a big part of it was injuries to the offensive line, which exposed really an injury to the offensive line, which threw the whole thing into chaos and exposed the lack of depth and the lack of proven players ready to step in after Branson Taylor was lost for the season. This year, the depth should be better. They brought in 3 transfers. They all have experience. At least 2 of those guys are going to start. Potentially all 3 could. Either way, you're going to end up with better depth than they had in 2024, which I think is the important first step. The starting 5 last year was fine. Not great, fine. I think the starting 5 this year can be fine. Maybe not great, but fine. Do they have the depth to withstand an injury, which, if recent history is any indication, will inevitably come? Are they deeper than they were a year ago? I think they are. That depth will probably be tested at some point. What's going to come of it? I don't know. I think Ryan Baer is a nice return at right tackle. I think BJ Williams is a nice young player. Lyndon Cooper, I think showed himself to be a really good center last year, and he'll anchor that line. You'll have the transfers, Keith Gouffet and Kendall Stanley and Jeff Percy to fill in the 2 left side spots, left guard and left tackle, and potentially even, push for a spot on the right side if all 3 are among the 5 best linemen on the team. But I think the depth will be better. How will it look when it gets tested? That's what we're all waiting to find out. Flip over to defense. Defensive end was that other priority position in the transfer portal this offseason. Really, they added 3 offensive linemen, 3 wide receivers, and 3 defensive ends. And so I think those were your 3 priority positions, the 3 position groups that the coaches really attacked in the transfer portal this offseason. And while wide receiver, they did bring in 3 and then lost 1 to the portal after spring camp, lost 1 of the transfers to the portal after spring camp. I put offensive line and defensive end a little bit higher than wide receiver in terms of priority in the portal. And I think there was more urgency for the coaches in the portal at attacking those 2 position groups, the offensive line and the defensive ends, because they were probably the biggest weaknesses on the team last season. The offensive line, like I mentioned, after Branson Taylor's injury was thrown into chaos. And then the defensive ends really just didn't produce at a high level. Jimmy Scott led all of the ends with 6 sacks. And I think your top defensive end needs to have more sacks. In this style of defense, this 4-3 defensive scheme with the way they play and the things they try to do, your top defensive end has to have more than 6 sacks. Last year, Jimmy Scott paced the group with 6, and 3 of them came in 1 game. No, I don't say that to disparage Jimmy Scott, who was really getting his, the most significant playing time of his career, and he ended up putting in a breakout performance with 6 sacks. He's got to do better than that. And the transfers they brought in have to do a lot more than the transfers that came in last year. And that's Blaine Spires, Joey Zielinski, and perhaps the highest ceiling of all, Jaden Moore, the transfer from Oregon. Those 3 guys have to fill out the rotation along with Jimmy Scott, and they have to produce. Pitt has to get a pass rush off the edge. And if they don't, you're probably going to end up with the linebackers having crazy numbers again, and I don't know if that's necessarily the best thing for this defense. This defensive scheme is at its best when they don't have to blitz all the time. And it's fun when they blitz all the time, and they like to blitz a lot, but when they're at their best, when they've had their best defenses, 2019, 2020, probably the 2 best defenses of the Pat Narduzzi era, 21 maybe you could throw it in there as well, but 19 and 20, you had Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver, Jones in 2019, Jones and Weaver in 2020. That year they were consensus All-Americans. You had those 2 guys going off and having big seasons. That's what you need. I think Haba Baldonado had like 9 sacks or something in 2021. That's what you need out of the defensive end position in this scheme. And they haven't had it since 2021. It needs to come back this year. They need more than they've gotten the last few years out of that defensive end position. That's as important as anything other than the offensive line and the quarterback. Defensive tackle, I think there's a chance for that position group to take a big step forward. And we've sort of been heralding this for the last couple of years, talking about how they have all these former 4-star prospects and they brought in all these transfers and the recruiting has been really good there. Well, it's time to start getting some production out of that group. In 2022, Kalijah Cansey was an All-American, had a great season. They haven't gotten that much out of the tackles the last 2 years. Now Sean Fitzsimmons is an upperclassman. Francis Brew is coming along, and Jasir Whittington and Isaiah Neal. You've got a bunch of these former 4-star guys. It's time for them to produce. Nick James, the transfer who came in from Indiana last year. You got a bunch of guys there who look like they should be pretty good players and pretty disruptive. They need to produce. Behind them at linebacker, you know how we feel about this group. One of the best collections of linebackers we've seen at Pitt in a long time. Maybe a chance to be one of the best linebacking cores, the whole group, maybe ever at Pitt. And that feels like a hyperbole and an exaggeration, but I think when you look at the numbers, it's not. You have one guy who had 100 tackles last year, was an All-American, another guy who had 82 tackles and 15 tackles for loss last year, and made his case as potentially one of the 5 best linebackers in the Narduzzi era just in one season. And you have another guy who played in a reserve role and had 10.5 tackles for loss. And he's ready to step into the middle linebacker job. Kyle Lewis, Rasheem Biles, Braylon Lovelace, I think are going to kill it out there. And the guys behind them, Cam Lindsey and Jeremiah Marcelin, they're young, they're second-year players, and I think they're more than ready to step in reserve roles. I think the linebackers are going to be really good. I think this is a strength of the team, arguably the strongest position group, the best overall position group, and I think it's going to be on display. I think we saw it last year with Lewis and Biles, and I think they're only going to get better, and Lovelace is going to take a big step into that middle linebacker spot. Cornerback at Pitt is, under Pat Narduzzi, is one of those positions where you just expect to roll guys through. They lost a 13-game starter from last season in Rylan Gandy, who transferred to Indiana. He was the player to be named later in the Nick James trade, apparently. So they lost Rylan Gandy, but they bring back Rashad Battle and Tamon Lynham, who both played a ton last year. They've got Shadarian Harrison, who was the defensive most improved player in spring camp. They brought in a transfer, Rashawn Murray, local guy who came in from Cal PA. They've got some good young players, second-year players, first-year players. Sean Lee, the freshman who enrolled early. You just at Pitt under Pat Narduzzi, the cornerback position, you just expect them to keep on rolling, and I don't see any reason why it would fall off. The names change, but they just keep having high-level play. And it's an unforgiving position, and there are going to be times where we say, why don't they give those guys help? Look, they're getting killed out there. They're left on an island. That's what they do. That's how they play. And, sometimes the most positive thing we can say about some of those corners is they just keep coming back for more. They got a lot of heart, they got short memories, and they go out there and they battle. And they get physical, and they grind. They make tackles in the run. They get physical with the receivers and disrupt their routes and the timing. And they're pretty good at it. And I think Rashad Battle and Tamon Lynham are pretty solid. I think Shadarian Harrison's going to be a star. And I think you'll see a couple other young guys emerge at the cornerback position. At safety, you've got, what potentially is the best overall position of the Narduzzi era. Like start to finish, 2015 through 2025. I think that position group has been stronger, more talented, deeper, and more consistent than any other position group on the team. They really haven't had many lulls. 2017 or so, Jordan Whitehead was still there. 2018 maybe. But by the time you get to 2019 with DeMar Hamlin and Paris Ford, it is on. And they have not let up. And so guys graduate, guys move on, guys transfer or whatever. They just keep rolling. And that's going to be the case this year. They lose Donovan McMillan, who had 115 tackles last year. First guy to have 100 tackles in back-to-back seasons at Pitt since Scott McKillop in 2007 and 2008. That's a loss. I think there's a chance the safeties will be even better this year than they were a year ago. Javon McIntyre's back. He's played a ton. Cruz Brookins is ready to step into a starting role. Jesse Anderson is ready to step into a top reserve role. They brought in the transfer, Kavir Baines Marquez from UC Davis. He's ready for a big reserve role. And then the freshman, Josh Garrier, watch out for him, man. I don't know if they're going to be able to redshirt him. I think he might be that good because, like I said, this is the strongest position of the Pat Narduzzi era. And then not just this year's group. This is the best linebacking crew of the Pat Narduzzi era this season. Overall, there's no position that has been stronger, better, more talented, deeper, and more consistent over the last 10 seasons than safety. And I don't see that dropping off at all this year. I think it'll be good. Got it? There you go. Every position. We touched on them all. And we didn't get into special teams. Ben Sauls is going to be really tough to replace. Caleb Junko is Caleb Junko. There you have it. All right. I can't wait. We're going to be down in the South Side today. We'll have lots of coverage from there. Jim's going to be at practice this morning. He'll have a full practice report on Panther-Lair.com, and then we'll have all the video coverage of Pat Narduzzi, players, coaches, everything you possibly need, all right here, Panther-Lair.com, and here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe, and then don't forget we'll be live tonight at 8:30 p.m. for this week's Panther-Lair show, where we will have a ton to talk about from training camp. All right, thanks so much for watching today. Hope you've had a great week so far. Enjoy your Wednesday. We'll catch up with you tonight for the live show, and then we'll see you tomorrow for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.